They thought I was weak when they kicked me out, all because I refused to pay $250,000 that wasn't mine. But what they didn't know was, their betrayal lit a fire inside me. And when I came back, I didn't just return, I returned with revenge. The demand for the $250,000 did not come gently, nor was it ever disguised as a request. It was presented to me as an obligation, as though my entire existence revolved around cleaning up the mistakes of someone else. My brother had piled up a debt so monstrous that even saying the number aloud felt heavy, and yet my parents stood there as if it were the most natural thing in the world to expect me to pay it off. I was not approached as a child of the family, not as someone whose life had value on its own, but as a lifeline, a financial savior who would pour everything into a black hole of irresponsibility. The moment is burned into my memory with sharp clarity. My parents' voices carried no softness, no hesitation. They spoke as if I owed them this sacrifice, as if being born into this family meant I had signed a silent contract to shoulder every mistake, every failure, and every poor decision that my brother had ever made. They didn't ask me how I felt about it. They didn't consider whether I even had that kind of money or what it would do to my future. All they cared about was that the debt was handled, that my brother's reputation was spared, and that their image as parents remained intact. I can still see the way my father leaned forward, his hand pressing into the table as if trying to pin me into compliance. My mother's eyes didn't plead, they accused. They accused me of betrayal before I had even spoken a word of refusal. To them, the $250,000 was not just money, it was a test of loyalty. And they had already decided that if I did not hand it over, then I was ungrateful, selfish, and undeserving of their love. Inside me, anger and disbelief clashed. I had worked hard for everything I had, piece by piece building a life that was mine. No one had ever stepped in to help me when I struggled. No one had lifted me when I stumbled. I had fought my battles alone, quietly, with resilience they had never even noticed. And now, after all those years of silence and endurance, they wanted to strip it all away to cover for my brother's recklessness. The very idea felt like an insult not only to my hard work but to my existence. The demand hung in the room like a storm cloud, pressing down on me with suffocating weight. I thought of my brother careless, entitled, always knowing that someone else would clean up after him. This was not his first mess, and my parents had always rushed to shield him, brushing off the consequences as if he were a child who didn't know better. But he wasn't a child anymore. He was a man who had made choices that came with heavy price tags, and now they expected me to bear it for him. $250,000. I turned the number over in my head again and again, the sheer magnitude of it crashing into me. It wasn't just a figure, it was years of my life. Years of sacrifice, years of everything I had worked for disappearing in the blink of an eye. Paying it would mean surrendering my own dreams, delaying every step I had carved out for my future, and chaining myself to a burden that was never mine to carry. What struck me most was not the number itself, but the audacity. The way they looked at me as though it were already settled. As though I had no right to say no. My parents had raised me to believe that family was everything, but in that moment, I realized that their definition of family was deeply twisted. To them, it meant unconditional sacrifice, but only from me. To them, it meant shielding my brother no matter how many times he failed, and casting me aside the moment I chose myself over him. I sat there in silence, every part of me screaming at the injustice of it. The table between us felt like a battlefield, their eyes firing accusations and my heart building walls. I wanted to ask why it was always me, why I was always the one expected to bend, to give, to carry the weight. I wanted to ask when my brother would ever be held accountable for his own life. But I already knew the answer. He never would, because they had decided long ago that their golden child could do no wrong, and that I existed to patch the holes he tore into the fabric of our family. The more I thought about it, the more the number transformed in my mind. It was no longer just money, it became a symbol of every time I had been overlooked, every moment my needs had been dismissed, every instance where my worth had been measured not by who I was, but by what I could give. That $250,000 stood for years of imbalance, of favoritism, of being invisible unless I was useful. It was the price tag my parents had quietly attached to me, and now they were saying it out loud for the first time. I could feel the sting of betrayal before I had even refused them. The demand itself was the betrayal. It showed me, more clearly than anything else, that my value in their eyes was transactional. I was not loved for myself, but for what I could provide. And the moment I chose not to provide it, I knew there would be consequences far heavier than rejection. The air in the room thickened as if the walls themselves were waiting for my answer, but deep down, I already understood that no matter what I said, something inside me had already broken. The humiliation did not arrive quietly. It came crashing into me with the sharp sting of wine splashed across my face. The glass was lifted in anger, not celebration, and in a single motion, my parents turned what should have been a discussion into a public spectacle. The liquid burned my eyes and soaked my clothes, dripping down onto the floor as though marking me with their disdain. I froze for a moment, not from the cold but from the shock of it. Never in my life had I imagined that my own family, the very people who were supposed to protect me, would resort to such an act. It wasn't just wine on my skin, it was shame, humiliation, and rejection, poured all over me in front of watching eyes. The sound of the glass slamming down echoed louder than words. It wasn't enough for them to demand the impossible. They needed to make me feel small for saying no. My refusal to hand over $250,000 had not only angered them, it had wounded their pride, and in their minds, I had to be punished. The humiliation became their weapon, a tool to remind me of my place in their version of family. To them, I wasn't a son or daughter worthy of compassion. I was a servant out of line, and they believed that dousing me in shame would bring me back under control. What cut deeper than the wine itself was the way they looked at me afterward. There was no regret, no hesitation in their eyes. They stared at me as though I deserved it, as though my refusal had stripped me of the right to dignity. My mother's lips were curled in a sneer, and my father's silence was heavier than anger. Around us, the room seemed to still, the air dense with tension, every second stretching into an eternity where my humiliation was laid bare for everyone to see. I could feel the heat of embarrassment crawl up my neck, not because I regretted my decision, but because they had chosen to disgrace me so openly. Every drop of wine that clung to my skin felt like a reminder that I had been cast out of their circle, no longer their blood, no longer their priority. It was more than an attack, it was an announcement, a declaration that I was no longer welcome unless I obeyed. The humiliation seeped deeper because of the silence that followed. My brother didn't defend me. He didn't even flinch. He sat back, smug, as though watching me being drenched in shame was nothing more than entertainment. His eyes glimmered with the comfort of knowing he would never face such treatment, that he was immune to their wrath because they would always shield him. That smirk carved deeper wounds than the act itself. It told me clearly that this was not only about money, but about hierarchy, about favoritism carved into the foundation of our family. I stood there drenched, and every fiber of me screamed that I had been made into a spectacle, stripped of respect in a single, deliberate act. The sting was not only on my skin but in my soul, because humiliation like that does not wash away. It lingers, it brands you, it forces you to see the truth about those who inflicted it. The people who were supposed to protect me had chosen instead to degrade me, to throw wine instead of compassion, to break me down rather than build me up. The public nature of the humiliation made it even worse. It wasn't just between us, it was meant to be seen, to be remembered, to be a warning. They wanted me to feel small not only in their eyes, but in the eyes of anyone who had witnessed it. They wanted me to carry the weight of that shame long after the moment had passed. And I did. For days, weeks, even months, the sensation replayed in my mind, the shock, the dripping fabric, the heat of their anger pressed against my skin. It was the kind of moment that claws its way into memory and refuses to let go. Humiliation, I realized, was not an accident. It was a choice. They could have argued, they could have shouted, they could have tried to persuade me again. But instead, they chose to degrade me in the cruelest way possible. They wanted to strip me of my voice, my strength, and my will by drowning me in shame. But what they failed to see in that moment was that humiliation has two sides. It can break someone, or it can awaken something fierce within them. The wine clung to me as I stood there, but beneath the dripping mess, My resolve began to harden. I didn't lash out, I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I let the humiliation settle into me like a scar, because I knew that scars do not disappear, they transform into reminders. Every time I thought of that moment, every time I felt the phantom sting of liquid on my face, I would remember not just their cruelty, but the lesson it carried. It was no longer about money or debt. It was about power, about how far they would go to keep me in submission, and about the humiliation they believed I would never rise above. But I carried it with me. The sting, the shame, the way my brother smirked and my parents stared without remorse. It dug deep into me, not to break me, but to carve something new into my spirit. Humiliation has a way of planting seeds, and though they thought they had destroyed me, what they had really done was ignite something far more powerful than their control. The betrayal did not come in silence. It came with the slam of a door, the echo of finality, the coldness of being cast out of my own home. After refusing to hand over the $250,000, I was no longer a member of the family in their eyes. They didn't just disagree with my decision. They decided that I had forfeited my place entirely. My father's voice was sharp and cutting as he told me to leave, and my mother stood beside him without hesitation, her arms folded tightly as though closing herself off from me forever. The betrayal wasn't just in the words, but in the unity of their stance. Together, they had chosen to abandon me. I looked around at the house I had grown up in, the walls that had witnessed my childhood, the space that once felt like safety. It no longer belonged to me. Every corner of it turned hostile in an instant, and I felt the weight of exile pressing down on me. It wasn't just about being told to leave, it was about being erased. They didn't care where I went, they didn't care how I would survive, and they didn't care what it would mean for me to be on my own. They only cared that I had said no, that I had dared to stand against them and refuse the sacrifice they demanded. The betrayal seeped deeper because of the casual cruelty in their eyes. They didn't flinch, they didn't soften, they didn't hesitate. To them, I had become disposable. A child they had raised, fed, clothed, and yet in that moment, I was nothing more than an obstacle to their protection of my brother. Their loyalty lay with him, no matter how many mistakes he made, no matter how much chaos he left behind. And so, I was exiled not for failing them, but for failing him. The golden child they adored, the one they shielded at all costs, had once again been placed above me, and this time, the price was my very place in their lives. I could feel the walls closing in as I gathered my things, each step heavy with disbelief. How could the people who claimed to love me cast me out so easily? How could the bond of blood mean so little when tested? The betrayal was not just in being told to leave, it was in realizing that my worth had always been conditional. Conditional on obedience, conditional on sacrifice, conditional on putting my brother first. The moment I chose myself, the moment I refused to be used, they cut me off as though I had never mattered. Walking out that door felt like walking away from everything I had once believed about family. I had grown up thinking family was supposed to be a refuge, a place where no matter what happened in the world, you would always belong. But the truth revealed itself in the harshest way possible. My family was not built on love, it was built on convenience. As long as I gave, as long as I bent, as long as I remained silent, I was accepted. The moment I stood up, I was a stranger. The night air hit me as I stepped outside, but it wasn't just the cold that made me shiver. It was the realization that I was alone. I had been exiled not just from a house, but from the idea of home. My parents had turned their backs, my brother smirked in his victory, and I was left with nothing but the echo of betrayal ringing in my ears. There was no apology, no second thought, no hesitation. They had decided that I no longer belonged, and they made that decision without a flicker of regret. What made the betrayal cut even deeper was the silence afterward. They didn't call out, they didn't chase after me, they didn't even look back. They let me walk away drenched in humiliation, stripped of dignity, cast into exile, and they carried on as though I had never existed. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I was never truly a priority, never truly loved without condition. My role had always been to give, and the moment I stopped giving, my place was gone. As I walked further from the house, I replayed every moment in my head, searching for signs that this day would come. And the truth was, they had always shown me. In every choice they made, in every way they favored my brother, in every dismissal of my needs, the betrayal had been building. This was not sudden. It was the final blow in a long line of wounds. The exile was the climax of years of being overlooked, years of being undervalued, years of being the shadow in a home that only shined for him. The betrayal carried weight not because I was cast out, but because it revealed the truth I had tried so hard to deny. That the love I thought was unconditional was never love at all, it was a transaction. And once I stopped paying the price, the transaction ended. I was no longer useful to them, and so I was discarded. The betrayal was complete, and with it came a silence more painful than any shouted word could ever be. Silence became my armor in the days that followed, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood that words would only fall on deaf ears. The humiliation, the betrayal, the exile, each moment pressed down on me, yet I chose not to shout, not to argue, not to plead. Instead, I carried my pain quietly, letting it settle into me like stone. There is a kind of strength that grows in silence, one that others cannot see until it is too late, and I began to nurture that strength with every passing hour. At first, the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. The urge to defend myself, to scream that I was not wrong, burned in my chest. I wanted to remind them of everything I had done, everything I had endured without complaint. But I swallowed those words, because I knew they would only be twisted into accusations of selfishness. Silence, I realized, was not weakness, it was a choice. A choice to conserve my energy, to protect what little remained of my dignity, and to prepare for something greater than petty arguments. Each quiet moment became a mirror, forcing me to confront the truth I had long ignored. My parents had never seen me as equal. My brother had always been their priority, their golden one, the child they would bend the world for. I had always been second, the one expected to give without receiving. In silence, I pieced together the pattern of my life, every memory fitting into place like shards of glass forming a clearer, sharper image. It was painful, but it was also liberating. Silence allowed me to see clearly what noise had always hidden. I moved through my days with an outward calm that surprised even me. People expected breakdowns, tears, desperate calls for reconciliation. But instead, I held my head high, even when my heart ached. The quiet became a shield that no insult, no rejection could penetrate. The world looked at me and saw composure, but beneath that still surface, something fierce was stirring. My silence was not emptiness, it was the steady gathering of storms. What they did not understand was that silence gives time. Time to think, time to plan, time to sharpen pain into purpose. I listened more than I spoke, and in that listening, I began to recognize the cracks in their power. My parents had used humiliation and exile as weapons, but they had overlooked one truth. Once you cast someone out, you can no longer control them. Their silence toward me was meant to be final, but my silence in return became freedom. I no longer needed to explain myself to them, no longer needed to seek their approval. In that quiet, I found a strength they had never given me. I remembered every detail of that night, the wine dripping from my face, the coldness in their voices, the door closing behind me. Those memories replayed endlessly, but instead of breaking me, they hardened me. In silence, I relived the pain until it no longer weakened me but steeled me. Each replay was like fire forging iron, each recollection another layer of armor. What had once felt unbearable became fuel, and the quiet around me allowed me to transform it without interference. People underestimate silence because they mistake it for surrender. They think if you are not fighting loudly, you are not fighting at all. But I understood that silence can be louder than screams, more dangerous than anger. It can conceal your intentions, hide your strength, and leave others blind to what is coming. My parents mistook my quiet for defeat, believing that I had been broken, that I had walked away in shame. But inside, my silence was constructing something stronger than anything they had ever imagined. I stopped seeking explanations. I stopped waiting for apologies. Silence gave me the space to let go of expectations that had chained me for so long. I no longer craved their approval, no longer yearned for a place at their table. Instead, I began to build within myself the understanding that I did not need them. My silence became self-sufficiency, teaching me to trust my own voice even when I chose not to use it. The world outside may not have noticed the transformation, but within me, every quiet breath was a step towards strength. I carried myself differently, stood taller, looked at people with a steadiness I had never known before. The silence that once felt suffocating had become empowering. It was no longer about what I couldn't say, it was about what I refused to give away. My words, my energy, my emotions, all became treasures I guarded carefully, saving them for the moment they would matter most. In the stillness of nights when memories threatened to overwhelm me, I reminded myself that silence was not emptiness. It was a vessel I was filling slowly with resilience, with patience, with clarity. Every insult, every betrayal, every wound they had inflicted became another drop in that vessel, and I carried it with me quietly. The day would come when the silence would break, when everything I had held inside would no longer remain hidden. But until then, I embraced the quiet, knowing that it was shaping me into someone they would never recognize, someone they would never be able to control again. There is always a moment when the weight of suffering shifts, when the balance between endurance and defiance tips, and you can feel something inside you snap into place. That was my turning point. It did not arrive with a sudden burst of triumph, but with a slow, steady realization that I had nothing left to lose. My family had already stripped me of dignity, thrown me out, branded me with humiliation. I had been betrayed, silenced, cast aside. And in that emptiness, in the hollow space where belonging used to live, a fire began to burn. The turning point came quietly at first. I remember sitting alone, retracing every wound they had inflicted, every moment when my worth had been dismissed. The pain was sharp, but beneath it was clarity. I understood that the people I had called family were never truly mine. Their love was not unconditional, it was transactional, and I had finally refused to pay the price. Instead of crushing me, that truth gave me power. I no longer needed to seek their approval, no longer needed to bend under the weight of their demands. For the first time, I saw myself without their shadow over me, and that sight was liberating. What fueled me most was the memory of their faces, the cold indifference as they cast me out. They believed I would crumble, that without them I was nothing. They expected my silence to be defeat, my exile to be the end of me. But the very act meant to break me became the spark that transformed me. Their cruelty had given me freedom, and that freedom became the soil where something far stronger began to grow. The turning point wasn't just about realizing their betrayal, it was about reclaiming myself. I began to see every sacrifice I had made for them in a new light. Every time I had put my brother first, every moment I had silenced my own needs to meet theirs, every hour I had spent trying to prove my worth, it all came rushing back, not as pride, but as proof of how much they had taken from me. And I vowed, in that moment of clarity, that I would never allow anyone to strip me of myself again. I felt anger, but it was no longer wild or consuming. It became controlled, focused, a steady flame instead of a raging fire. That was the difference. Before, anger had only left me feeling powerless, shouting into the void. Now, anger became my compass, pointing me toward a path of action. I realized I could take everything they had thrown at me and turn it into fuel. I could take their rejection and build resilience, take their humiliation and build pride, take their betrayal and build strength. The turning point also shifted the way I saw my brother. For so long, I had viewed him through the lens of favoritism, as the golden child who could do no wrong. But now I saw the truth. He was weak, shielded from the consequences of his actions, incapable of standing on his own. His power only existed because my parents enabled it, because they drained me to protect him. Stripped of my compliance, their entire illusion began to crumble. For the first time, I realized that I was the one with the strength, the one who had carried the weight all along. It was a revelation that felt like lightning striking through the darkness. The power dynamic I had lived under for so long was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. I had always been told I was less, treated as if I were replaceable. But the truth was clear now. I was the foundation, the one who held everything together. By refusing to pay, by walking away, I had revealed their fragility. My absence exposed the hollowness of their love, the fragility of their loyalty, and the weakness of their chosen child. The turning point was not about vengeance in that instant. It was about awakening. It was about seeing myself not as a victim, but as someone who had survived everything they had thrown at me. Every scar, every wound, every drop of wine on my face, every cold word became proof of my resilience. I had endured it all, and I was still standing. Stronger. Sharper. Ready. It is strange how suffering can harden into determination. I found myself carrying their rejection not as a burden, but as a weapon. I let the memory of that night replay in my mind, not to torment me, but to remind me of what I would never allow again. Each replay strengthened my resolve, sharpened my focus, fueled the fire that was growing inside me. The turning point wasn't one single moment, it was 1,000 moments finally coming together, aligning to show me that my silence had not been the end, but the preparation for something far greater. I began to carry myself differently. My steps were no longer weighed down by the hope of their approval. My voice no longer trembled with the fear of rejection. I no longer walked in their shadow. I walked with the steady certainty that I had faced the worst they could do and survived it. That survival was my strength, and that strength was the foundation of everything that came next. The turning point was the quiet transformation, the moment the victim became the fighter. It was when I stopped asking why they had done this to me and started asking what I could build from the ashes they left behind. It was the shift from despair to defiance, from silence to strategy, from pain to power. It was the realization that I no longer needed them, that their betrayal had freed me to become something they could never imagine. Revenge is not born in a single breath, it is forged slowly, piece by piece, in the fire of betrayal and the cold of silence. It is not the kind of anger that lashes out wildly, but the kind that waits, sharpens, and hardens with time. By the time I reached the point of no return, I was no longer acting from raw emotion. I had carried the humiliation, the exile, the betrayal long enough for them to transform into something far more precise. Revenge became not just a desire, but a necessity, a way to reclaim what had been taken from me, to restore balance where there had only been cruelty. The thought of revenge first crept in like a whisper, almost too quiet to notice. I would remember the sting of wine dripping from my face, the way they had cast me out without hesitation, and my silence would replay those moments again and again. Each replay sharpened the image, not just of what they had done, but of what they deserved in return. They had humiliated me publicly, discarded me carelessly, chosen my brother over me without hesitation. If they thought they could strip me of my worth and walk away unscathed, they had gravely underestimated the strength their betrayal had built inside me. What fueled me was not just anger but clarity. Revenge, for me, was not about petty retaliation. It was about justice. It was about holding them accountable in ways they had never held my brother accountable. They had lived in comfort while I carried the weight, they had celebrated him while silencing me, and they believed they could continue this pattern forever. But now, the silence they mistook for weakness had turned into strategy. Every humiliation became a tool, every betrayal a weapon, every memory a reminder of why I could not let this go unanswered. There is a particular satisfaction in imagining revenge, not in the violence of it, but in the precision. I thought of how they would look when they realized I was no longer broken. I thought of the shock in their eyes when the very child they cast out returned, not begging for forgiveness, but standing stronger than ever. Revenge, to me, meant flipping the script, making them feel the very powerlessness they had inflicted on me. It meant showing them that their cruelty had consequences, that their betrayal was not the final chapter, but the spark of something they could never control. The coldness of revenge is what makes it powerful. Hot anger burns too quickly, but cold revenge lingers, calculating, patient. I carried my plans quietly, letting them form in the stillness of nights when the memories threatened to overwhelm me. I shaped them with discipline, reminding myself that this was not about reckless outbursts, but about creating a reckoning they could not escape. They had silenced me once, but now my silence was the calm before the storm. The thought of my brother often ignited the deepest flames. He had watched as they humiliated me, as they threw me out, as they stripped me of belonging, and he had done nothing. He had even smirked, enjoying my downfall, secure in his role as their favorite. My revenge was not only for myself, but also against the illusion of his invincibility. I wanted him to see that the one he had mocked, the one he had thought was beneath him, was the very one who would undo him. His comfort had been built on my sacrifices, his protection on my silence. Stripped of that, he would finally face consequences he had never imagined. But revenge was not about screaming those truths into their faces. It was about letting reality itself scream for me. My plan was not to shout louder than them, but to live louder, to succeed in ways they never believed I could. Each achievement would become a strike, each step forward a reminder of what they had lost. My existence, unbroken and unbent, would be the loudest form of revenge. To walk back into their world not with apologies, but with power, that was the vision that fueled me. I often thought of the moment they would realize the tables had turned. The same way I had felt humiliation burning on my skin, I imagined them feeling the sting of their choices. I pictured their pride collapsing under the weight of my defiance, their certainty crumbling when they saw the child they dismissed become stronger than the one they had protected. Revenge, in its truest form, was not about destroying them, it was about making them live with the destruction they had caused, reflected back onto themselves. The patience it required was immense. There were nights when I wanted to lash out, when the pain bubbled so close to the surface that it felt unbearable. But I held it back, knowing that revenge is sweetest when it is cold, when it is deliberate, when it arrives not as desperation but as inevitability. Every delay made it sharper, every moment of restraint made it stronger. I let time become my ally, and with each passing day, I grew more certain that my revenge would not fail. In the end, revenge was no longer just about them, it was about me. It was about proving to myself that I was not the broken, discarded child they thought I was. It was about turning my suffering into strength, my silence into strategy, my exile into freedom. It was about reclaiming my story from the ashes they had left me in. They had chosen to cast me out, but they had also unknowingly chosen to create someone they could never defeat. Revenge was not just my weapon, it became my identity, the final piece of armor forged in betrayal, silence, and pain.